Welcome to the ODI, everybody. Really great to see you all here on a Friday afternoon. So I'm going to introduce our CEO today, Jeni Tennison, who's going to be talking about whether we should have faith in data. Before I do that, just a couple of kind of housekeeping reminders. The talk is going to be live streamed, so if you can wait until the end of the talk before you ask any questions, that'd be great. And if you could also ask your questions into the microphone, just so everybody at home can hear you. For comments and questions during the talk, if you want to tweet us at #ODI Fridays, that'd be great. So yeah, introduce you to Jeni.
Thank you, Richard. So the origin of this talk is that some of the team were asking me why I kept going on about our decisions being informed by data rather than driven by data. So this talk is my explanation to show them and train them about why that is, but also hopefully of interest to you guys too. We make decisions all the time, every day, all the time. I was thinking about the kinds of decisions that I make. I think about how to get across London to my next meeting. I have decisions that affect the people in my lives, like where to send my kids to school, some of which are quite constrained decisions, of course. Decisions that affect other people in the team, like how much to pay them. And decisions that affect, well, our general environment, like so who to vote for, decisions that are combined with other people's decisions and then lead on to decisions that are then made by government about that then bounce back on me. So decisions made all of the time. And we humans are really bad at those, at decision making. There are lots of ways in which we're bad at decision making. If you look at Daniel Kahneman's famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow, about different kinds of decision making processes and the kinds of biases that we have, anchoring, where, you know, if we're given a particular number, then we will fixate on that number and provide other numbers that are similar to it. Availability, where any kind of scenario or anecdote that is very immediately obvious to us, we will use in order to make decisions. Things like being ultra optimistic but really scared of losing things, so holding on to stuff as if we've got it. Or the sunk cost fallacy, where we think just because we've invested a lot of effort in something, we need to continue it to its end. All of these things make us bad decision makers as humans. And there are other things as well. This is a really interesting study about judges who are making decisions about whether people should be let out on parole. And what it looks at is energy levels through the day. And it turns out that judges are more likely to make favourable decisions after they've had a break, and really unlikely to make a favourable decision if it's just before lunch. So our bodies and the amount of energy that we have in them alters the way in which we make decisions as well. Humans are bad at decision making. And data comes to the rescue, right? Data can help us to make those decisions. We often say here at ODI that data helps us to navigate to a decision, that we use data in order to help us to get to those decisions. We talk about data as being like roads that we navigate down in order to get to a better decision and then act on the world. So when I need to travel around London, then of course I use the data that is given to me by Citymapper in order to do it. It helps me to know where there are blockages. It helps me to know where there are links between different services. It means that I can do that smoothly. When I need to look at where I send my kids to school, I go and have a look at the statistics about that school so that I can see that I'm going to be sending them to one that's going to boost their science and maths, and who cares about art, right? How much to pay my employees? Well, benchmarking is a good way of working that out. So I can get data about that. If I pay for a service, I can get data about to benchmark what they should be receiving. And of course, I use data in order to help me know which way to vote. Famous data like that on the side of a bus. So data, great. Data can definitely help us to make better decisions. And that means that we are starting to, as a society, drive the decisions that we make using data. Some examples. What adverts we see when we go online is driven by data that is collected about us as we navigate through the web. This is a really scary picture of all of the organisations that are involved in working out what kind of adverts to display to you, including those that tag you as you navigate through different websites to try and work out what you might be interested in, what kind of person you are. We're developing tools like Watson Health or the DeepMind tools that are helping us to make decisions off the back of lots of data collected about patients in order to work out how we should be treating people when they're ill. We use data that's collected immediately, but also data about road networks, data about where there is high traffic, et cetera, to drive autonomous cars, right? And of course, that kind of data is going to be even more important as we get more automated transport. But these data-based decisions, these data-driven decisions, are not necessarily good decisions. Let's have a look at some places where that's going wrong. This is a famous example from a year or two ago where Google Photos labelled black people as gorillas, tagged them as gorillas, so that when you searched for gorillas, you would get black people back. That's a decision that's made by an automated system that is bad. This is from just a couple of days ago. There's a new system being put into place by Ministry of Justice where if you have one of these, if you have a traffic incident, you're speeding or you park in the wrong place, they're looking at systems so that you can plead guilty and pay the fine just online, very easy, which isn't necessarily bad, except that, unlike the subtitle there, what could possibly go wrong with this madcap scheme? It isn't necessarily bad. It cuts out cost, and we can see why we want to nudge people into not taking up court time. But on the other hand, if people are pleading guilty because it's the easiest thing to do rather than because it's actually right, then that is a bias that we might want to think about, take care of. This was a scandal, a Centerlink scandal in Australia that happened kind of over Christmas time, which was where two sets of data were being linked up together behind the scenes in ways that didn't quite work. That meant that many people in Australia were getting issued debt notices for debt that they didn't actually owe. And of course, that led to lots of anxiety for them and problems. And even though there was an accountability mechanism, i.e. they could object to it, it still meant that they had the stress of being issued with one of these debt notices that were incorrect because the linking algorithm was wrong or had errors within it. How long we spend in prison. This is an article from ProPublica where they dug into software that was used in order to help judges to work out what sentence criminals should be given, based on what it has seen of their past and also general patterns in the population. And what the study showed was that it was systematically biased against black people, that they would get longer sentences than white people using this automated system. So there are places where data-driven decisions can lead us to bad outcomes. Now, I'm a developer by training and background, and as any developer knows, all code has bugs in it. No matter what you do, all code will have bugs in it. And the same is true with data. all data has flaws in it of different kinds. Examples of where that happens. How we collect data, what data we collect, can lead to biases. So we may have biased data collection. We might miss out certain parts of the population because they're hard to reach, for example. Even automated sensors will have errors in them just because of mechanically there will be some kind of little variability within the sensors that means that you can have tiny pieces of error, even in the most automated systems. We get people, when we are collecting data, who lie or who lend their Oyster card to somebody else, so we get different data about what their journeys would be. Data that we rely on that gets out of date because it's only uploaded every month rather than, or only recalculated every year. And also fragmentary data. I don't just mean that only bits of data get collected, but also that in the decisions that get made, systems have to only focus on particular bits of data. That's how it works. You can't capture the entirety of the context and environment in which things happen. All of the political subtext, all of the environmental subtext. You can't capture all of that as data. So those things don't get put into our algorithms. Necessarily, data that we collect is fragmentary. It doesn't cover everything. But all those flaws, it doesn't mean I'm not arguing that we shouldn't use data. As I said, data is extremely valuable for helping us to make decisions. It just means that we shouldn't be blind about those faults, and we should be putting in place processes and governance structures and other kinds of practices that mean that we can detect when those happen and do something about it. So it doesn't mean we shouldn't use data, just not blindly. And what I wanted to go into for the rest of the talk was just to explore some different ways in which we should be having some best practices about where we are using data to make decisions. And these best practices, I think, are particularly important where we're using automated systems or we're using data to make decisions that affect people. Because the decisions that affect people are those that are most important to us as a society, right? So particularly for decisions that affect people, what should we do? I have 5 things. First of all, and this is a very obvious one from somebody who works at the Open Data Institute, is be open to scrutiny. So documenting and being open about what data is being used, how it is being collected, what algorithms are being created, etc., means that those can be looked at, they can be examined, they can be judged, they can be corrected. Okay? But if you don't have that openness, then there is no way of correcting for or knowing when things may be going wrong because of systematic data collection biases, for example. So that's really easy to say. The sad truth and reality is, however, that just being open doesn't mean that people look. If we really wanted to rely on openness as a way of making sure that bad things don't happen in our decision making, we would fail. You need to have some kind of proactive monitoring of what is being used to make decisions that affect people. And also we have the complexity of the fact that some of the algorithms that are used to make decisions about us are not understandable. They're ones that are generated through machine learning. It's hard to pick them apart. It's hard to understand the logic behind them because they have been simply generated by code. And so even if you could open up the kind of black box that is a neural network, you wouldn't necessarily be able to understand exactly what is going on or why behind the scenes. So openness is great, and it's very important, providing that context about how data is collected to help people know the scope to which they can use it to make decisions. Being able to look at algorithms to see how they're put together is all very important, but it doesn't take us to where we really need to go. Second thing, allowing appeals and challenges. So if we have systems that affect people that that we have no opportunity to appeal or challenge against, then we have no visibility about where it might go wrong. And people who are affected because, for example, their data has been recorded incorrectly or is out of date, then they have no way of appealing against that decision that has been made against them. So building in an appeals or challenge process when decisions are being made based on data is extremely important. Again, though, that can only really work if people know that these are the particular pieces of data that have been used to make this decision, and this is how they have been put together. Otherwise, they don't know to say, oh, actually, you've got my age wrong here, and therefore my insurance premium has been calculated incorrectly. One thing I wanted to point to here was some work by projects by IF, where they have been exploring different design methods for displaying that kind of information. So this one is an example of a data access tracker where when you are engaging with the service, it will also tell you about what data has been collected and when it has been accessed and how it is being used, right? How we communicate that back to people so that they can understand how their data has been used to make a decision about them and therefore appeal it if necessary is really important. And we need new design patterns to help us do that. So those are great. Being open, having an opportunity to appeal. But as I talked about with the Centerlink example, it's still the case that a decision that is made about you can affect you, and even if you can appeal against it, the whole process you have to go through in order to make that appeal is extremely stressful. It takes time. it has a negative impact upon you. So tailoring algorithms so that they are aware of, so that they're adjusted to take account of the impact of errors is really important. By the way, background picture is risk, because risk, impact, I don't know. Anyway, that's why. So an example, using that Centerlink example, if we have an algorithm that's deciding whether or not we should get a debt notice, then obviously if we don't owe money, then we should not get a debt notice. If we do owe money, we should get a debt notice. That's the way a perfect algorithm would work. And there are different kinds of errors that every algorithm will have along those lines because they can't, there's always bugs, right? And data always has flaws, like I was saying. But if we, the type 2 error, the false negative error, so when I owe money but I don't get a debt notice, that has no real impact on me, except actually I get away with it, right? It does have an impact on government because it's not collecting all of the money that it should do, but the impact on me is not so good. So that is not big. So that kind of error is less impactful and less worrying than the kind of error that we've been seeing with the Centerlink example, which is type 1 error, a false positive when I don't owe money, but nevertheless you give me a debt notice, right? So when we're creating algorithms, there will always be these two types of errors. But we can adjust algorithms so that they're more likely to give the kinds of outcomes, the types of errors that are less likely to have a negative impact on us than the types of errors that are likely to give a terrible impact on us. And so that's my third kind of point, that we should be tailoring our algorithms so that they are biased towards not having a negative impact rather than being biased towards those impacts that could be less important. Fourth thing, enabling reflection and correction. So here I'm starting to get into the maybe this is more of a speculative thing that we could be looking at. So we as humans are always biased, right? I talked about how we have biases in decision making. But one thing that we as humans do is that we reflect and try and correct our own behaviour. So we might come out with something kind of on impulse, a decision on impulse, but rein ourselves back. That's part of having the second system of thinking, that the slow level of thinking that Daniel Kahneman was talking about. What if we had those kinds of mechanisms in decision-making systems as well? And there is some work towards this. It is possible to take out some bias within even machine learning algorithms if you know to look for it and if you know to take it out. So there's a whole series of papers by these people from Microsoft Research and Boston University where they are looking at the relationships between words, so in particular analogies. So man is to computer programmer as woman is to homemaker. Those are analogies between men and computer programmers and women and homemakers. If you take all of the natural language that are used typically in order to understand, say, for example, CVs or articles, etc., they have built into them, because of the way in which we use language, these biases that will make a computer think that men are more likely to be computer programmers and women are more likely to be homemakers. That's because the language that we use reflects the world rather than the world we have, rather than the world we want it to be. And we as a society try and push back against that. We as humans try and push back against that. But it's apparent in the corpus of text that is used to drive these kinds of algorithms. However, it is possible to, and these researchers are looking at how to say, well, these are the kinds of biases that we do not want to have existing in our systems, and therefore we will programmatically remove that as a source of bias. So they take the gender specificness of those analogies and they remove that gender specificness from the way in which they encode the words, hence giving us a system that has that kind of bias actually removed from it rather than pre-existing. So take a look at that. It's really, really cool research. So it's possible for us to build, even with machine learning, algorithms that do not display those kinds of biases if we know to look for them and if we specifically go out and do it. So shouldn't we, when we have algorithms that are being used in order to affect people's lives, shouldn't we be automatically also having algorithms which test whether those biases are happening, which flag them to us, and which remind us to go back and change the algorithm, change the way it works in order to remove those biases? The background here is from the performance dashboards on GDS. So any service that is being provided by the government could automatically detect whether the decisions that are being made or the use of the service is biased in some way, and could report that back so that we know to adjust the algorithms themselves, and even eventually get to the state where that was doing that automatically. And this is particularly the case and particularly important where we have shifting societies and shifting norms and changing data over time, which will change the way in which the system works. So that was my fourth. And fifth, which again is really kind of thinking a bit out there, I don't know whether this would work at all, but introducing diversity into decision making. in places where we as a society have an environment that are making decisions that really affect people, as in courts, we have this system of having a jury to make those decisions for us, right? We trust a group of people, and a diverse group of people. This is not a diverse group of people. This is from a jury from ages ago, right? So, but we trust a diverse set of people, of our peers, to make a decision on our behalf. It is true that we've seen that having diversity in decision making in general, even between humans, leads to better decisions. How could we use that as a way of introducing better decision making to where algorithms are involved? And this kind of happens a bit in some places. So in the automatic landing algorithms in big aeroplanes, they actually have 3 different computers that are all calculating the same thing as you're coming into land. And if 2 of them agree and 1 of them disagrees, then they ignore the one that disagrees and they take the one that agrees. And that's because the sensor, like I talked about with the sensors and things like that, then you can have these small mechanical interruptions which can mean that the information is not accurate, or the computation is not accurate. And so having voting between the 3 systems gives you a more robust decision overall. So you could have multiple systems that were created perhaps based on slightly different data sets or under slightly different conditions, and try and have a vote between them to get a bit of diversity in decision making. Or the other system that I was thinking about is again, how do we make decisions in really important circumstances as humans? Well, one of the ways is through argument. We have when we have a court case, we have a prosecutor and a defendant, and lawyers arguing on their behalf from one side and from another side. And it is that argumentation that helps us to get to a better decision, right? Because they are able to weave a story backed up by facts that argues for a particular side, and it's the one that is most persuasive that is the one that wins. But through it all, and I suppose what I'm really arguing for, is that in certain circumstances where it's really important and where human lives are affected, we ought to be coming back to human judgment and take our responsibility as people seriously, rather than just divesting that to machines. And that is because we possess qualities that machines can't possess and don't possess. We have a much better ability to understand the full context in which we are operating, and we have essential human empathy for people. And I think that that's important in the decisions that we make. And so to summarize, I think obviously algorithms and data should be open to scrutiny. We should be supporting appeals and challenges, tailoring our algorithms so that it takes into account the impact of errors, not just whether there are errors or not, enable that reflection and correction to root out bias, and introduce diversity. I think that would be a really interesting avenue of exploration, introducing diversity into automated decision making, which is why I always argue that decisions should be informed by data, but not driven by data. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jenny. That was really interesting. So we've got some time now for questions. If you're listening or watching on the live stream, you can ask questions by tweeting us at ODIHQ and put in hashtag ODI Fridays into the tag. So I've just got one question to get us going whilst people think of their own questions. Those kind of 5 principles or doctrines, if you like, of how to make ideas,
okay,
yeah, dial it down from doctrines, right? Are there any exemplars that you know of in the world today that are kind of incorporating some of that already, if not all of them?
Okay. Oh God, that's a difficult question. Why didn't you ask me that before you?
I'm in trouble now.
Yeah. So no. as in, well, no, that's not quite true. I think that the foundations of some of it in, for example, the way in which we provide and talk about statistics, where we provide a huge amount of context about how the data behind statistics are collected and collated and analysed, and that is a form of the openness that I was talking about, right? So having openness about that is definitely there. I think that there are obviously places in which we have openness in the code and algorithms that are used. So some of those get published, and so people can go and scrutinise them, supposedly at least. So I think some of the openness things and some of the transparency things are kind of there. I think it's fairly well accepted that you should have some appeals process. So, for example, even in the Centerlink example, there is an appeals process that you can go through, but haven't seen stuff that is adjusted to the level of impact that it's going to have. I haven't seen any examples of that, and the others, apart from the kind of examples that I pulled out, I haven't seen.
So lots of work to do.
Yeah, I think so.
Are there any questions?
But I might just not have seen it. So. My bias in my my interests. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeni. Any questions from the room? There's one over there. So you could just speak into the microphone so that they can hear you at home.
Thank you. You were talking about adjusting algorithms to reduce the impact of errors. What do you do about where there is a disagreement about who is being negatively impacted? So in your example, it was kind of clear, but if in sport, for example, in drug testing, they try to reduce false positives because they say it destroys careers, but it has a knock-on effect on the false negatives, so more people get through. So who decides on those thresholds, or is that another governance question?
So I think that there aren't going to be hard and fast rules about any of this, and it's one of the reasons why a lot of people. So, for example, the Royal Statistical Society and we and other people argue that we need to have a proper data ethics board or group that can be referred to make those kinds of decisions. Whether that is doing the kind of early on scrutiny around openness or making early decisions about how to bias algorithms, having those kinds of groups involved just to have somebody to knock it against, if not anything else, I think would be really important.
We've got a couple of questions on the other side of the room.
Thanks. I wanted to pick up on the Centerlink example a bit, partly because I think it's even worse than you were suggesting, and partly because I work at DWP, so there's a bit of thank God it wasn't us this time about it all. You framed it as there's a decision which allows an appeal. And actually there's something about that framing which is itself problematic. So the machine's made a decision, and it's your fault as the individual if it's wrong, and you've got to do something to redress this wrong that has been done. So I wonder if we should start thinking much less about decisions as a helpful concept. There's a proposition that this algorithm has generated is that you might owe us some money. And actually we should, in the nicest possible way, and possibly ultimately in a rather nasty way, but let's start nice, it's a conversation. Is this a correct representation of reality or not, rather than I have decided you've got a problem if you don't like it.
Yeah.
And that relates then on second concern I had, which is your next point around tailoring algorithms. The kind of the balance between the false negative and false positive is actually a bit more tricky than that, because obviously being told I've got a debt that I don't really have and being made to pay it is a bad thing. Actually not being told a debt now, which I'm blissfully unaware of, but somebody might come for me next year or the year after when it's mounted up and there's interest and maybe my circumstances are less able to make me pay it, is actually not a good thing either.
Right.
So in the same way as the previous question, tuning the algorithm to reflect that range of biases is itself going to be a massively, massively difficult thing.
Yeah, yeah. So, and I think that both of those points come back to, I really like your idea. This is a proposition and it's the start of a conversation. I think that that's one of the things that I really fear in data-based decision-making, where we do not have the critical thinking to say, actually, I think you're wrong in this circumstance, or where the design is set up to make you think that it is the truth, and you have no form of redress, or you can't really object because it must be true, kind of thing. That's one of the things that we see our behaviour as people where we tick the agreement in the consent in the terms and conditions because it is easy to do and we want to get to where we want to go. It is just the case that we are biased towards the easy path, and so that's one of the other reasons why I get concerned about talking about data-driven decisions rather than informed decisions, because it takes the human's responsibility to challenge what has come out of the equation. And I think we should have that responsibility to challenge it.
Let's go another question here.
Thanks very much for a really clear lecture. I work at a think tank called Future Advocacy, and we're looking at the policy surrounding the opportunities and risk by artificial intelligence and use of big data. And I really like the 5 ideas that you put forward as a basis for moving forward to construct policy. But there are 2 aspects which I'd value your opinion on. The first is, for example, you put that slide up with all the companies, that mass of companies that use our data to target advertising. How do we get the buy-in for the companies and this trade-off between use of our data for their own profits and what do they give us back? So sort of how do we get the company buy-in, and also how to make the general public care about their data. We're very, as you said, the easy option is to tick, give away all my data. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
So on the second point, then where I currently am on that is that I think it's very difficult to make people care about something that seems very abstract, but people do care about it when a decision is being made about them on the basis of that data. And so my feeling is that we should be looking more at the decision-making end of the process than at the data collection end of the process, and that kind of reflects back to your first point, which is about how do you get business buy-in. Well, businesses want to be able to collect data in order to make their own informed decisions themselves. And so battling with them about what they can and can't collect is a difficult place to start with them. But on the other hand, talking to them about how they maintain the trust of consumers, how they make a safe environment for their customers, those kinds of things, I think they're much more motivated to be involved in. And then it comes down to, like I say, look at the decision-making end and what the impact actually is on how that data is being used on the customer to then build back to the business.
So one question over here, and then maybe we'll ask some of the online questions.
Thanks. I was really interested in your suggestion that argument was a way to overcome some of the limitations of being data-driven, and the idea, the adversarial model like we use in court, or even theoretically in Parliament, where we have the opposition holding the government to account. Remember that?
Yes. Vaguely.
But it seems that, and then you did go on to talk about human judgment, and I was thinking that making an argument, that kind of marshalling evidence from a particular point of view, has some very human characteristics. The narrative, exactly, the narrative, but also the motivation, the kind of the sense of a particular goal, the sense of interest that you're representing, the ability to think yourself into the other side's mindset and go, if I were them, what would I be asking me? So I felt that was part of you saying, this is where we need the humans and the human judgment. But am I wrong? Is that the kind of thing that you could be looking to build into algorithms?
So I think that there are two ways in which you can think of it. Part of it is you can think of it as, okay, let's make the algorithm that's making the argument in one particular direction, but then specifically empower the person to be critically thinking about that to make the argument in the opposite direction, right? So the adversaries are the computer and the human. But I was actually thinking about it in terms of could we create two different algorithms that would be biased and argue for particular outcomes, and then try and judge between those. Again, like this was just an idea, looking at what is it that has worked where we have biases in our human decision making. What are the ways that we have got around that? Are there same kinds of techniques that we could employ with artificial intelligences as well? So yeah, both of them.
Just got one question online and I'll come back to this.
Yeah, we've got a question from James on Twitter who asks, does the difference between data, information and knowledge sometimes lead to misunderstanding?
Lead to misunderstanding. It's very difficult with a 140 character question. Okay, I'm sure that the difference between data and information and knowledge sometimes leads to misunderstanding. We think that, so I'm going to interpret a question in a particular way. We can think of data as being kind of hard facts, the stuff that is on the ground and that is irrefutable, even though often it isn't because of we think of it as being like that. And that as we have systems that are layered on top of that, and interpretation that is layered on top of that, that becomes information, it becomes knowledge. And the further that you get away from the hard facts, the more bias and the more interpretation is layered on top of that. If we think that what is being presented to us, which has actually come through those layers of interpretation, is still hard fact, then it causes problems. So for example, whatever it was, 350 million on the side of a bus, that is something that has gone through a number of layers of interpretation in order to get there, is no longer a hard fact and causes us problems because we get misled. That might have been the question, I don't know.
Okay. In regards to sentencing and human judgment and fairness, if you were to take the race and ethnicity out of the equation, do you think that would get a kind of a fairer sentencing? And if that is possible, that's all. How can we go about getting that? So
in the particular example that I talked about, the ProPublica one, where it was using an automated system to do that, they looked very definitely at people who had where the only difference really was about race, and taking that out of the equation, and that was how they detected that there was a real bias there, right? I think that there are those kinds of mechanisms, like I talked about, around the gender splits, about if you are aware of those biases, then you can build that those biases are easy to occur. Then you can build in the algorithms to stop them from happening. But you need to be monitoring it in order to make that to detect where that is occurring, and it's not obvious when you first create the algorithm off the back of the data that you have that you are building in those biases to the algorithm, because you're not, for example, coding specifically on race, but you're coding a whole bunch of data points that are associated with race, and that is what generates the outcome that you get to. Does that answer your question, sort of?
Yeah, sort of. So if you were to take...
Just speaking to the...
Oh, sorry. So if you were to take, I mean, in either instance, if it was, whether it was gender, whether it was ethnicity, if you were to take one out, you would, and if you took it out across the board, would you, in your opinion, get fairness?
Would you get fairness?
Or could you get fairness?
Well, fairness is such a relative concept. Is anything really fair?
It's what we all want. We just want, we just want a society that is.
I think, so the way that I would think about it is that there are certain things that we have recognised in society are places where life isn't fair for us, right? There are certain places where we know that there are biases around gender, we know there are biases around race, we know there are biases around our economic status, and so on and so forth. We pick those out and we choose which ones to target. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other places where there is built-in biases, and so it doesn't necessarily give you fairness. It just addresses that particular unfairness. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So just one last question, because this chap popped his hand up before we start running out of time.
Hi, I'm from BCS, the Chartered Institute for IT, and I've recently started kind of trying to get my head around personal data as a big old topic. And I think one of the things that struck me quite early on is that there does seem to be a massive disconnect between the the people who are collecting and dealing with people's data and the public, and that seems to be based on the public just feeling a complete lack of control. When things come out like the recent transformation strategy, the assumption seems to be that the public's on board with the sharing of data.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my question is, how do we get to those kind of lofty expectations where data can be used kind of productively, and which I would assume means giving the public some feeling of control, really?
Yeah, so I think that openness and transparency is at the heart of that. So I think that being more public about what is actually going on and why data is being shared and the benefits that brings, I think is at the heart of how we get the public on board with that happening. I think that what tends to happen currently is that data gets shared behind the scenes, nobody knows about it, then it comes out with a big splash and it's a big horror story, and that always drives down trust. And we get into a state where we get worried about talking to the public about how we're using their data because we're worried about them responding in this very negative way, which leads us to hide it, which leads us to then have the big splashes, which diminishes trust even more, right? I think that we should be trying to get into a positive cycle where we are being much more transparent and open about how data is being used and for people's benefits. That includes in general, but it also includes specifically, as in your data is being used right here. The sharing of data from these particular organisations has made this a really nice, smooth transaction for you right now. And your data has been shared with these people, which has led to these breakthroughs in medicine, etc. Right? I think sharing it, making it very specific for individuals is also important. So openness and transparency. If we can be open about using how that data is being used, the benefits that it brings, and open about the struggles that we have about knowing where to draw those lines. And have conversations about that and have open conversations about that, I think that we can get into a better cycle where our use of data is more trusted, where the public is more informed, and that means that we can get the best out of data overall.
So we've run out of time, but thank you very much for coming along, and thanks for all your questions, and thanks to Jenny for giving a really great talk. Just a quick reminder, there's no lunchtime lecture next week because it's half term, but we'll be back the following week. So hopefully see you then. Thanks very much.
Thank you.